I hope everyone's having a good week. Thanks for joining us for today's session of Ethics Week 2019. Before we get started, please let me acknowledge the sponsors of our event this week. So the Mendoza College of Business, our Notre Dame Delight Center for Ethical Leadership, and Chase Bank. My name is Jessica McManus-Warnell, and I'm in our Management and Organization Department over in Mendoza. And I'm very excited to be welcoming two of our faculty as our featured speaker for today's session. Thanks also to Brian Levy, Professor Levy, and Professor Ken Milani, who have been the brains behind Ethics Week for a long time now. So allow me to introduce our guests, please. Dan Graff is director of the Higgins Labor Program at the Center for Social Concerns, where he develops education, outreach, advocacy, and research initiatives exploring the dignity of labor and the rights of workers in the Catholic social tradition. He convenes ongoing projects like the Labor Cafe, Advocacy and Interaction Group, the Higgins Alumni Network, and curates original content online, including fun features like the Labor Song of the Month and the Labor Question Today blog. And that reaches colleagues all over. Graff's primary academic interest is in undergraduate teaching. His faculty appointment is in the Department of History, where he served as the Director of Undergraduate Studies for 15 years. He's the winner of a 2011 Joyce Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching and a 2013 Dockweiler Award for Excellence in Undergrad Advising. His research centers currently on two projects, one on the history of race, labor, slavery, and freedom in 19th century St. Louis, and two, the development of a just wage framework, which we'll hear about today, an online tool and related efforts. Charles Hurst is an assistant professor in our Management and Organization Department in Mendoza College of Business. Dr. Hurst's research focuses on interpersonal relationships, personality, and gender in the workplace. She teaches social innovation at the MBA and undergrad levels. Dr. Hurst has 25 years of experience in the social enterprise and academia and is passionate about creating and disseminating knowledge that positively impacts society and in building the capacities of social enterprise to grow their impact. So please join me in welcoming Professors Graff and Hurst.
All right, so I guess I'm first. We're going to split this down the middle and hopefully have plenty of time for Q&A and getting some feedback. I want to thank Professors McManus-Warnell and Levy and the good folks at the Mendoza College of Business who've organized this year's Ethics Week, especially on the theme of economic inequality. I'm delighted that Professor Hurst and I, representing many folks from diverse disciplines across campus who make up our Just Wage Working Group, are able to present to you some of the fruits of our ongoing collaborative efforts. I believe that economic inequality is indeed the most pressing issue of our time, both within the United States and on a global scale. Frankly, the numbers are downright shocking. Within the United States, the average household income for the top 10% in 2015 was about $313,000, nearly 10 times the $34,000 for the remaining 90% of American households. And that gulf has been growing for decades, with the top 1% now capturing 22% of all income, which is more than double the top 1%'s portion in the 1950s. Meanwhile, CEOs of corporations now make 361 times what their typical workers earn. By contrast, in 1980, it was less than 50 times more. Meanwhile, more globally, Oxfam International reports that in 2018, just 26 billionaires possessed as much wealth as the bottom half of the world's population, 3.8 billion people. Slimmed down from just a year before that, 2017, when it took a whole 43 billionaires to accomplish what I would call as a dubious feat. All right, I can already hear these alarming figures, or what I'm saying are alarming figures, being argued away by many, especially conservative and libertarian-leaning colleagues and students. Don't contrast people of different incomes, they might plead, as that only leads to class envy of the successful. Instead, you should measure households over time, because as long as their own incomes are growing, folks everywhere, but maybe especially Americans, just don't care how rich their bosses are. A rising tide lifts all boats is the common refrain, canoe and cruise ship alike. The problem is that most Americans who don't own a yacht have been drowning for a long time. Just to take the US case, for the past 4 decades, real median wages in the US have been flat. As a typical worker in 2016 took home only 1% more in real weekly pay than one did in 1979. Even worse, those in the bottom 10% actually took home 5% less in 2016 in real dollars than in 1979. I would think many of us would think that such a foundational fact, 40 years of flat and even declining wages for ordinary folks, might shape mainstream public discussion of the economy amongst policymakers and pundits, but sadly that hasn't really been the case, at least until the last couple of months. For those in charge at our nation's capital over the past several decades, the health of the economy is measured instead by crude figures like GDP, gross domestic product, and the unemployment rate, which are regularly updated, religiously analyzed, and relentlessly repeated. If the former is up and the latter is down, we're assured the economy is doing well. As President Trump recently tweeted, in many ways, this is the greatest economy in the history of America and the best time ever to look for a job. Well, the unemployment rate is indeed at its lowest level in nearly 2 decades, a good thing, no doubt, but that doesn't tell us much, if anything, about the nature of the jobs being created, including how much they pay. And the government's own numbers provide more sobering news. For the vast majority of American workers, real wages actually declined over the past year. If it's the best time to look for a job, then it's apparently not the best time to earn a living from one. Over the past decade, to be sure, thousands of workers and their allies, in unions and out, have been trying to change that. The multi-front Fight for 15, as well as the shorter-lived Occupy movement, have successfully raised public awareness on the realities of low-wage work and increasing inequality, respectively. While legislatures, local governments, and voters via referenda have raised the minimum wage in 29 states, as well as cities like Seattle, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. Still, these worthy efforts have gained little political traction at the national level, leaving the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour stuck for the past 10 years. And in another indication that this is what I would call a chronic crisis, this is not something new, this is something that's been going on for the last 4 decades, the minimum wage's actual purchasing power in the United States peaked in 1968, and it's been on a relative decline since then. And this is all despite polls consistently showing that Americans in a bipartisan fashion favor higher minimum wages. They might disagree on how high, but they support raising the minimum wage. Similarly, a majority of Americans from both parties also support raising taxes on the wealthy to curb inequality. A Politico poll that just came out last week reveals. And again, there's differences on how much to tax, but consistency across partisan lines that the wealthy should be paying more. Still, but bold New Deal-like proposals to transform the situation have met with very little reception inside the Republican or the Democratic establishments, again, at least until very recently, when suddenly there's a lot more talk about raising taxes on the wealthy, emulating the language of the New Deal with this Green New Deal and these sorts of things. These observations, 4 decades of feeble policy initiatives in the face of flat wages and increasing inequality, provide one motivation for the formation of this just wage working group at the Higgins Labor Program that I direct and which is housed in Getty's Hall in the Center for Social Concerns. The other motivation stems from the Center for Social Concerns' core mission, which is to apply, assess, and refine Catholic social tradition, or what we call CST, via direct engagement with real-world problems. So for those who are unfamiliar with CST, Catholic social teaching is the Catholic Church's rich body of commentary on real-world or social concerns. Dating back to the late 19th century, CST combines papal encyclicals and other church statements that lay out avenues toward justice for the world's peoples in a variety of contexts: familial, economic, cultural, and national, to name a few. In short, CST, again, Catholic social teaching or Catholic social tradition, is the church's vocabulary and ideas that try to bridge the spiritual and the secular realms of human existence. When it comes to the economy, for example, the church, through CST, has long been deeply committed to fostering the dignity of work wherever it's performed, seeing it as a central core aspect of the human experience and needing to be valued as such. Securing a voice for workers in the decisions that affect them. So one is fostering the dignity of work. Two is securing a voice for workers in the decisions that impact them. Three, promoting the common good in economic relationships, at least trying to figure out a way to talk about that. So building on these core principles of CST, and inspired in particular by Pope John Paul II's claim that, quote, a just wage is the concrete means of verifying the justice of the whole socioeconomic system, unquote. I and my colleague Clemens Sedmak, who's a theologian and an ethicist with a joint faculty appointment at the Keough School of Global Affairs and the Center for Social Concerns, a couple of years ago decided to form an interdisciplinary working group to try to probe the foundational question: what makes any given wage just or unjust? We pulled together a group of scholars and students from a variety of disciplines: history, economics, law, sociology, business, poverty studies, theology, to apply a CST lens to the persistent problems of pay disparity and increasing inequality. And our working group's collective answer, which is still a work in progress, but we'll introduce it to you today, is our Just Wage framework and online tool, which Professor Hurst will introduce and walk you through in a moment. But before we do that, let me close with a few things that we've learned as a group. This is from my perspective, but I think it's widely shared amongst the working group. Things that we've learned about the usefulness of deploying Catholic social teaching as a lens through which to pull scholars together from different perspectives and to explore what I call problems of pay. First, because Catholic social teaching is rooted in concerns about individual human dignity, about community flourishing, and then about the relationship between those two, CST promotes thinking that's expansive, encompassing, and relational, thereby providing a vehicle to pull together those from different disciplinary and practitioner perspectives whose intellectual and policy paths might not otherwise intersect. So it provides a common space and vocabulary for discussion. And one salutary effect of that is the avoidance of simplistic or single bullet solutions to knotty, complex problems, such as what makes a wage just or not. The second thing, as our image here of what I call a hexagon of honeycombs suggests, we see the just wage framework as interconnected, as not necessarily hierarchical, and as embedded within and intimately connected to broader political, social, and environmental structures. A reminder that a wage, any wage, whether just or not, cannot and should not be solely determined by the individual employer-employee relationship. It must be shaped by government policies, embedded within community structures, and both of those, government and community, influence all aspects of our lives as workers. Everything from healthcare to housing, transportation to training and education, from private food banks to public parks, right? This is what some scholars call the social wage. Nobody's standard of living is determined solely by the wage that they make on a paycheck from an employer but it's also in the form of the society in which they live that takes care of roads, that provides fire, safety service, all these sorts of things. That's the social component of the wage. But whether embodied in legislation or not, certain core values, again, rooted in CST, undergird our just wage framework. A belief in the dignity of every human person, a commitment to the common good, and a fidelity to the practice of sustainability. Not only at the level of the natural environment, which is often the way we think of sustainability today, but also at the level of the organization that is hiring people. In other words, when advocating for the promotion of a just wage, we need to be sensitive to sustainability at multiple levels. Yes, from the ongoing vitality of the natural habitat within which the economy operates, yes, certainly. But also to the long-term vitality, the viability of the individual enterprise employing and paying workers. A third and final point about CST. While we have rooted our efforts in CST principles, the just wage framework and tool are designed for use by any and all stakeholders, whether Catholic or non-Catholic. Because CST appeals to fundamental, widely shared values, we believe those principles should be transferable to people regardless of religious affiliation and in secular contexts. Beyond that, CST's insistence on humans as inherently relational and social beings, no human is an island, is the way to say that. That insistence on the relational aspect of the human condition facilitates a framework that foregrounds interconnectedness, inviting us to think not only about minimums, which is often the way we talk about wages, wage floors, poverty thresholds, but also maximums, wage ceilings, this question of excessiveness, as well as the relationship between the two. Ultimately then, CST principles have helped us distinguish our just wage framework from other living wage models through an emphasis less on dollar figures, especially minimums again, and more on a holistic view that combines many components, both quantitative and qualitative. And we might get more into that later, perhaps. But now I'll turn to Professor Hurst to introduce you to our just wage framework and show you how we envision this online tool operating and discuss what we see as its relevance for important conversations we think we need to be having about our economy today. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. You didn't use your mic, did you?
I think, was the mic on? I think so, yeah.
Oh, okay,
Yeah, it's working.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about how our tool is used, but more importantly, I'm going to talk about the conceptual framework around it a little more. So this is just a very rough mock-up of the tool. So this is basically, it's how we've interpreted CST, these criteria, these 7 criteria, is how we've interpreted CST as it relates to a just wage and embodied it in a tool that various stakeholders can use. So we intend for this to be used by business leaders, by activists, by scholars, policymakers, and just regular people interested in the topic. And they may all be coming to it from a different perspective or with a different intent. They may be a business leader receiving pressure from inside or outside about the wages that they pay, or just morally concerned about, paying people justly. They may be a policymaker looking for a framework for how to think about policy and just wages. But we're hoping that ultimately it'll help to bring together parties that often tend to be at odds over the issue of wages and give them a common platform for discussion about what citizens of our society can rightly expect as a standard of living, what our society needs, and what role business has to play in that. So as Dan said, we titled it as the Just Wage Framework, but it actually encompasses a lot more than what we typically think of as wages. It's not just about money, so it's not fully descriptive. We're looking at really the full compensation package. So we're looking at it more like the way organizations look at it. If you're a human resources manager making recommendations about pay, you're not just going to be looking at the wage. So any business leader, most of them will tell you their biggest expense is labor. And it's not just what they're paying monetarily, but it's all the other things. It's 401k contributions they're making to retirement funds, what they're spending on health insurance, which is a huge expense, So we're looking more holistically in the same way that organizations would, but we're also going beyond that because an HR manager is focused on the health of the enterprise, and we all know that HR managers absolutely don't mind setting pay very low, below what we would consider a living wage. So we're looking at it through the CST perspective, balancing concern for the sustainability of the enterprise with a concern also for individual, family, and societal well-being. So as Dan said, we do take sustainability of the enterprise very seriously. If the business can't survive, it can't compensate anybody. So that's another reason to consider a broad set of factors. So a wage that provides for basic needs is non-negotiable. But beyond that, there are options for justly compensating people that don't necessarily have to cost the business a lot more money. So research shows that people are willing to trade pay for other benefits, like having more time off, more time with their families, more opportunities to pursue outside interests. There's research showing that a lot of Americans would rather work for part-time, even professionals, but part-time jobs are just not available. They're not very widely available. You're gonna work full-time as a consultant or accountant or whatever, or you're gonna work not at all. So employers can consider ways to actually pay people more justly without necessarily spending a lot more money. You just have to be creative. So the fact that our tool is holistic sets it apart from other calculators you find online. So there are living wage calculators where you can input, a family size and a geographic area, and it'll tell you what would be a reasonable living wage for that area. And a living wage is defined as a wage that covers just the very basic expenses, housing, transportation, clothing, just the most basic. And in the U.S. as a whole, a living wage is calculated to be about $15, but of course there's huge variation in that because cost of living is so much higher in certain areas than in others. It takes a lot more to live in San Francisco than it takes to live in Elkhart. So also, the living wage does not take into account emergency savings. So if your car breaks down, a living wage is not going to cover that. You'll still be under financial strain if your car breaks down. And if you're making a living wage right up to retirement, you may be okay covering your basic needs, but when you retire, you haven't had money to save for retirement, you will probably be in poverty. So a living wage even, which we tend to consider the highest standard, even activists, we set the bar, activists, advocates for a higher wage tend to set the bar kind of low in advocating simply for a living wage because a living wage is still going to ultimately expose individuals and society to a great deal of risk. So that's one reason we're going beyond the living wage. So another way that this tool is different and more comprehensive than others, Stan kind of intimated, is that we are looking across the wage spectrum. So we're, of course, very concerned with poverty, but societal well-being depends on the well-being of all of us at all levels of society and middle class and professional workers. And we hear a lot about this now, the plight of the middle class. Middle class and professional workers face serious challenges that may not be reflected in their pay rate necessarily, but nevertheless are really critical. And for instance, many professionals now are on call all the time, are working 60 to 80 hours a week, which eventually leads to burnout. Also makes it really difficult to manage to have a life outside of work, especially once you have kids. We have an aging population. We have, now what they call the sandwich generation, boomers, who are still raising kids and are also taking care of parents. So that puts tremendous strain on people, particularly if they don't have time and money. So the answer for this is often to have one person, one parent, usually the mother, stay at home, but that tends to make the family's economic position more fragile. And it's not necessarily positive for the economy in the long run. Family doesn't have a buffer if you only have one earner, and also suppresses women's careers, which also is not very good for the economy in the long run, particularly since more women are going to college now than men. We kind of need women in the workforce. So finally, even when it comes to pay, a typical professional in one of these high-cost cities can find themselves very strained. San Francisco is often invoked as the epitome of this. San Francisco and Silicon Valley, you have people making, upwards of $100,000, people ranging from nurses to engineers who find it unmanageable to live near work. They may be commuting hours a day, and if they do live near work, they're living in trailers or dormitories or substandard housing. There is literally outside of Stanford, near Stanford University, there's literally a street full of trailers where employees of Stanford live. So clearly when people are doing jobs that are vital to society, so we often argue, well, people who don't make enough money, they don't do jobs that are important, they can be easily replaced. Well, you can't easily replace nurses and engineers. So when people are doing jobs that are inarguably vital to society and still can't make a decent living, then that's something we really need to take a look at. So I'll go into the tool now. We identified 7 criteria rooted in CST that compose a just wage, and each one is assessed by a number of indicators. And I don't have time to go through each indicator in detail, but I'm going to give a broad overview and show you how the tool works. And like I said, this is rough. So we're going to be looking to you for input and on what, as users, you might be interested in seeing after you go through the tool. So someone coming to the tool would go to the first criterion. The first criterion is that the wage enables a decent life for the workers in the household. So this is the just wage part, the living wage part. So the first one, the wage covers the basics necessary for a minimally decent life for worker and family household. So you see already, we're much more holistic than the living wage, because that's the living wage. And then we go into the necessity of hours of work that are predictable and not excessive and provide weekly rest. So this again covers the full wage spectrum. People at the lower end of the wage spectrum often don't get as many hours as they want, and they get very unpredictable schedules. People at the higher end, professionals, are often tasked with excessive hours and also unpredictable schedules. So that's one of the criteria. So if you click on another indicator, that hexagon is going to get darker. The more indicators that you can click, the better. So then we'll go to the second criterion. The wage enables asset building. So this is enabling savings and property ownership. And property ownership, we know, is the key way that the middle class in the United States has traditionally been able to build wealth, and it's increasingly out of reach for people, particularly in large cities. So that's one of the requirements. Also, that people's wages can grow. As Dan said, wages have been essentially flat or declining when you take into real cost of living and so forth. So it enables wage growth. Also includes benefits for educational and skills enhancement. And this is particularly critical right now at this historical moment. And again, it's critical across the wage spectrum. So I've been reading a lot recently about artificial intelligence and its impact on the economy, its impact on the labor force. And so with the increasing automation of many jobs, including professional jobs. So, some of you in here are probably majoring in accounting, planning to go into accounting. 40% of accounting tasks are going to be automated within the next less than 10 years, like very, very soon. So what accounting companies are saying is that it's enabling them to eliminate a lot of the lower level tasks and enabling accountants to focus on more strategic level sort of work. Problem with this is that the people who can do strategic work are the experienced people who come in on entry level. Those jobs are automated. So then now what happens to the people who are coming in at the entry level? And executives are saying that, all employees, because of automation, they're going to need to keep reskilling throughout their careers. The skills that you need are going to keep changing. So you're going to have to keep learning. And right now it's a huge question. It's, vexing a lot of business leaders and economists how we're going to retrain all these people who are going to be just automated out of the workforce. And people with college degrees are relatively safe now. People without are less so. So the people with less cushion to be unemployed are more likely to be unemployed. And this goes right to income inequality, just figuring out what to do. How do we retrain these people? How do we get them back into the workforce and avoid massive unemployment and severe shortage of qualified people to fill the jobs that we do have? So you actually are seeing, Dan was talking about how people who are more conservative may sort of bristle at the idea that we need to raise wages, and that does tend to be, the views on this tend to fall along ideological lines, but that's becoming less so as people are realizing the instability that could be created in society as a result of these changes to our economy, and also that they, even professional level workers, could be hurt by what's happening. Even professors could be automated out of our jobs. People, machines could figure out how to teach you guys a lot better than we can and do research. So So a friend of mine was telling me the other day, who studies artificial intelligence, that he was listening to or saw some interview with a guy who's a well-known libertarian. I can't remember the name, but he was actually advocating for a universal basic income, which I doubt many of you have heard of, so I'll give you a brief description of what that is. It's basically the idea that the government should give everybody a basic income, rather than just basing it on, who's in poverty and who doesn't have an income, what you think of when you think of welfare. Give everybody a basic income so that once all these people are out of work, we know that everyone has a basic standard of living. And there are actually experiments going on now to try to test out this idea of a basic income in Canada and parts of Europe and even parts of the United States. But to hear a libertarian, someone who doesn't believe that the government should really be involved in individual and private matters at all, should just get out of it, saying, yeah, we might need a basic income, is just tremendous. So that just gives you an idea of how, what a radical change is coming, and how we need to rethink how we pay people. So where was I? So fourth, the wage structure is non-discriminatory, so it's not, wages are not contingent upon any factors that are not related to performance. In order for us to know that wages are non-discriminatory, we need transparency. So there have actually been some locations, some locales, not in the US, I don't think, but in Europe, where they're actually requiring publication of wages across the spectrum. And some companies are voluntarily providing that information. There has been a law, there is a law now that you have to publish CEO pay, right, Dan?
Right, but it's controversial.
It's controversial. It's probably gonna go away. Yeah, but right now. So just transparency. You need transparency to know whether people are being paid fairly. The wage is not excessive. So this again goes to the upper end of the wage spectrum, and what CEOs are being paid. So you make sure that you don't have huge divergence between what people at the lower end are being paid and what people at the highest end are being paid. So, you don't have CEOs who are earning exorbitant amounts relative to the people in their organization, in their communities, and relative to their value to the enterprise. So plenty of research has found that CEO pay is not necessarily reflective of or tied to the performance of the firm. And in fact, you have these examples of CEOs who run firms that end up being found to have engaged in huge amounts of corruption. For instance, Wells Fargo recently, some of you may have heard of in recent years the problems that Wells Fargo's had creating fake accounts and just doing all kinds of funny stuff to make money. And people lower on the chain just lost their jobs, period. But they were taking orders. There's good evidence that that was kind of an enterprise level decision to push those behaviors. And their CEO walked away with tens of millions of dollars. So she resigned. So that's certainly inarguably excessive. So 6, workers have a voice in their pay. The wage reflects participation by workers. So traditionally, participation by workers has largely been through labor unions and workers being represented by labor unions. That's much less so the case today as the labor movement has been, significantly weakened largely by public policy and law. But there are other means, worker participation boards in the company where the company is actually listening to workers, employee ownership, employee participation on the board of directors. So, some of these various mechanisms that workers can have input into their pay. And finally, of course, pay should be linked to performance, whether you're the CEO or somebody on the front lines. You should be making the money that you deserve and not necessarily money that you don't deserve. So again, that requires transparency as well. So that covers that. So that's basically the tool. We're kind of trying to figure out where to go next. So we'd like to hear from you, if you were a user, what you'd want to see after going through the tool. But I want to close before we take questions and talk about one common argument that people tend to have about paying higher wages and providing more benefits, and that's the impact on the firm. So we did talk about sustainability. How do you sustain the profitability of the enterprise when you're paying more money? So a few things to think about. First of all, just how much profit the firm needs. how much more the firm needs to grow. This idea that we need to maximize shareholder returns is kind of the ascendant view. But you could also consider that firms were created for society. We weren't created to serve firms. Business was created to serve us, and not just a few people, but society as a whole. And so therefore, perhaps we consider profitability and returns in the context of the entire society. And in fact, the earlier economists like Adam Smith did talk about how firms should be paying people according to the norms of the society, kind of the standard of living in society. So it wasn't like profitability of the firm above all else. Whatever we have to do to make it work, we'll do it. It's profitability in the context of the firm serving societal purpose. So that's one. Another one that's perhaps even more important is that wage raises, like anything else a business does, need to be implemented strategically, right? So you don't implement any business decision just in isolation without thinking about how it's going to affect other parts of the business and how you can make it work. So there are firms that have raised wages, like retail firms, that have ended up doing better, if not just as well, by also making other changes. Like, for instance, you pay frontline workers more, but you also give them more discretion. So they're able to make more decisions at the lower end. They also have better benefits. They have better health care. So they're healthier, there's less turnover, and they're also able to serve customers better because they can be more responsive to customers in the moment. So, so if businesses can be creative, if they can implement strategically, it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's automatically detrimental to the firm. So that's all I have to say. We can take questions. We have about 20 minutes, so if you have comments, questions, we'd love to hear it. Dan, did you want to add anything?
No.
Okay.
Talked enough. Happy to hear from others. So
I wanted to make one comment, I guess, and it's on the term income inequality. One of the first, I'm also very concerned about this issue, but I get very concerned that the term income inequality is not appropriate, because I think we're always going to have income inequality, no matter what type of system. I don't think there's ever been a system devised on earth that hasn't had income inequality. So I think it's more an issue of the level. I don't know what the right term is, but I think it's an issue of the level or the extremeness of income inequality. And so I'd like to encourage people who are doing work in this area to try to come up with a term that accurately describes the issue. My concern about using the term income inequality is if you say income inequality is causing problems, you've given people who don't want to believe this is an issue an easy target to shoot at and say, what do you mean it's a problem? We've always had income inequality. This is not a problem, and it's not a problem. It's the extremeness. So I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, that's true, and I've heard people say, oh, well, we can't just have everybody making the same thing no matter what, which is
not going to happen.
Clearly a straw man, and nobody advocates that. So maybe just always specify severe income inequality.
Yeah, severe, extreme. I don't know what the term is, but it'd be nice to have an acceptable term that really defines the problem.
Yeah, I agree.
yeah, appreciate the point. I think if the issue is equality or inequality, either or,
it's not that
if that closes off dialogue, then that's a problem. So it's a useful thing to think about. One of the interesting things we've gotten in feedback is a real enthusiasm in certain audiences for talking about excessiveness, which is a sort of related to extremeness, you might say. So
and in your talk, you're characterizing it by comparing it to earlier levels.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe earlier levels were too extreme. I don't know.
Yeah, right.
But you're sort of claiming that earlier levels were fine and now it's not fine. And that's really part of the argument. Is what is the right level? And we'll never know what the right level is. It's sort of like, it's one of these things where a lot of times you don't know what the right level is, but you know when you see it,
right,
that it's too far.
Well, and that's one of
to where it becomes dysfunctional.
One of the reasons we emphasize less coming up with a dollar figure to spit out, like a lot of the living wage calculators do, which I find those useful and helpful. So it's not a diss on people trying to shoot for certain goals in terms of real numbers. But one of the virtues, I think, in trying to take a more holistic approach, on the one hand, you're at the risk of being accused of being vague and not saying anything beyond platitudes, but on the other hand, the hope is that you invite dialogue and bring folks together. It's interesting that some of the employers and management side attorneys that I've talked to about this have actually talked that their sort of response to this kind of approach might be a way to get them at a table to talk about it rather than just seeing, oh, this is about me paying too little because I'm not paying that number, so therefore there's nothing to talk about. So I appreciate the sort of, I think more about this sort of term, inequality and what to do with that, but that's a great point.
Maybe we shift to talking about equity instead of equality, because equality is inherently, everything is the same. Equity is that it's fair.
Yeah, I don't know.
Income equity.
I don't
think about it.
I guess the other issue that would challenge you on to think about is income is just one concept of what people get out of the economy and out of society. I wonder, a broader concept I think is wealth. In fact, and I'm not an economist, but I think you could think of income as being nothing more than a flow of wealth. And so in our economy, we have stocks of wealth that if we have a good economy, hopefully grow. And then we have flows of wealth that intermix among how it's distributed based on your efforts or your work or your luck, right? It's lots of different reasons people get lots of wealth. And so that's something else maybe to think about. I worry about income is maybe too narrow to really get at the fundamental problem.
Yeah, that's kind of, when I say the wage, saying it's a just wage is not really very descriptive.
I mean, my daughter graduated from Notre Dame a few years ago. She's a photographer in LA. She doesn't get a wage. She's a self-employed photographer.
Yeah.
So
I mean, at the same time, the reason the term wage and a just wage appeals to me is because for most people who rely on a wage in order to survive. So it's a very inviting term. They're familiar with it. Trying to then get people to see that the wage is more than just the paycheck. It includes non-monetary as well as other monetary things that don't show up in the dollar that you get to put in the bank. To me, that's a way to appeal to people where they start, and then you push them on. But certainly the notion of the way we're trying to talk about a wage is a more expansive one, and raising questions about how people are compensated. And right, there's a whole challenge to this is what you might call the decline of the traditional post-World War II U.S. version of the employment relationship of a career in a single firm with a full-time job, right? Everything from the gig economy to, there's all sorts of things. The economy doesn't conform to that anymore, and we're very cognizant about not trying to turn the clock back. The point is, yes, use some reference points on issues of equality and the trends, but figure out a way to move forward that allows us to envision different ways. But still, most people work for someone else in order to survive, so that's still critical, I would say.
I think one of the stickier aspects, though, of developing our tool, and you just touched on it, is that we haven't addressed the gig economy or freelancers. And I've been reading that companies are more and more planning to use freelancers and contractors over time. As automation, more jobs get automated, they want to be more flexible about their workforce. And so probably people in this room graduating will find that a lot of their opportunities are going to be more likely to be freelance, and we have to think about what just compensation is, because right now freelancers just get money and that's it, and you have no security of employment and you get no benefits, you cover all of that yourself. So then we really have to think about what's just in that context.
So I know Ann had her hand up for a long time. Professor Tsui, expert on this.
I have a comment to make about income inequality, and then I have a question about your last criteria on your model. It's really hard to determine what difference between CEO pay and average employee pay, right? There's just no objective kind of standard by which. But one way I think about it in terms of my writing is comparatively. Why are CEOs doing similar job, same industry, are paid so much more in some companies than others, or pay more in some countries than others? So, for example, CEO employee pay ratio in Norway is about 8 times, in here USA it's 361 times. Is it really American CEOs are 300% more, or whatever, 200 times more smart than the CEOs in Norway? Okay, if you think about that, you can does it justify, what is it about the US CEO that justify their pay being so much more than comparable CEOs in other countries or in other countries, even within the same industry? So there's some ways to think about that, okay? The question I have for you is in the 7th criteria in terms of determinants of wage. You put down performance, qualifications, and industry. I mean, those are all good factors to consider in determining someone's wage. I'm curious about why is it you don't put need in it? Because we think about just wage, right? Think about providing basic minimum level of a decent life. The need ideas to me is crucial. Because without a need, you can justify anybody's pay at any level, say what I mean, all the other criteria is just value judgment. And for us, need is also value judgment. So I think that
So you don't see that in
encourage you to think about that.
number one? Do you see that in the
Maybe
first?
some other places?
The first criterion,
Yeah,
decent
yeah.
life.
I understand that you have it in the first
Yeah.
one. So in the 7th one, you kind of remove that. So the question is, if people are going to go to the 7th criteria, what do you determine the wage to be for any job in any industry? But with the word need is not there, then it could override. I don't know.
We don't think of it in terms of overriding. I think implicit, and maybe we need to make it more explicit, is that, yeah, it should be tied to performance, but there is a floor. Like, there's a floor below which you don't go. And then on top of that, you know, what other factors do we
Right.
consider?
Yeah, well, in the management literature, I mean, they really, perform merit versus need, right? So in terms of seniority is another criteria, which is not related to performance. So there are multiple criteria in there, but the word, I really just encourage you to think deeper about if you remove need in any standard performance, any measure of any criteria used to judge the level of pay for a particular job.
Interesting.
And the need is really important.
Appreciate that. It's interesting that 7th criterion, we've gotten some pushback from labor union folks on that who are extremely suspicious of merit pay as a concept being something that can be valued transparently in an equitable fashion. So it is interesting speaking to different audiences and then getting the different reactions too. Certainly to me, the core of that 7th criterion is a nod to the notion that people who go into serious education and take out loans in order to achieve a certain, professional standard and then go into work might be paid more. A surgeon might be fairly compensated more than somebody else. So that was the sort of root of that and recognizing that, but it raises all sorts of interesting questions, right? And that's why we think talking about justice is at first problematic to many, but the hope is that because most people think they're just in the ways that they approach things, and if they feel that as the starting point, and they feel that they can be heard by others in discussing what's just, that you can bring people to a metaphorical table, I guess. But thank you, Ian, very much for.
Hi, thank you. I'm Ben Phillips. I'm here as a Hewlett Fellow on Public Policy.
Oh, yeah, you just sent us an email.
You email because I'm working on inequality, so it was fantastic to hear this presentation. First of all, say I loved it. I thought it was great. And 2 aspects I thought were really powerful, and then a third I'd love to hear more from you on. On the technical economics was very strong, the kind of efficiency economic argument. And then the ethical one was hugely important, also very important. The third one, which I'd love to hear more from you on, is the power politics. And this affects at both ends of the spectrum. So one of the challenges of today's level of wealth inequality is that the very rich are not just so rich that they buy yachts, they're so rich that they buy politics. They create the rule-making framework, and that creates a power and wealth cycle that means, for example, as we saw with the most recent tax cut that went through for the very rich, there were handwritten things being phoned in by lobbyists at the last minute to get into that bill as we see from the power of big pharmaceuticals to make life-saving drugs inaffordable for people who might die, as we see from the power of tech companies and others to shape things. At the other end of the scale, if you're poor, you're weak, and if you're weak, you get poorer. And so it's possible that you could be, and I believe you are, correct on the ethics and correct on the economics, and yet not succeed because the politics, the power politics, is against you. So I'd love to hear from you about how you'll win. I mean, I'm on your side. How do we win?
I think Professor Hurst has the answer.
I never thought you would have to answer that.
I was looking at it this morning and I was like, this is extremely ambitious. Like, every single one of these things is there are entire organizations dedicated to trying to deal with. So.
Yeah, we presented the sort of earlier version of the framework this summer in Washington, D.C. We workshopped it with about, 25 folks from different NGOs and just sort of dedicated to fighting poverty and improving workers' rights, these sorts of things. I think my initial answer to this is power is a major problem, and that this just wage framework is not something you read this and apply it and solve that power problem. Is there a way that this framework can be harnessed by those who are pushing to fight against what I would call excessive inequality and extreme inequality in ways that will further their work? So we want practitioners to be able to use this in negotiations, between union and management. Perhaps it could be a useful tool, or a lobbying vehicle that assist in someone lobbying for a certain bill. So, I mean, thinking about how to incorporate the question of how to address power, and this is a big one that I take, and I'm alarmed, frankly, at the ways in which I do agree with you that economic wealth translates to political power, and in the contemporary United States, I really see that happening in ways that are not easily curbed. Are people familiar with this relatively new book, Winners Take All?
Yeah.
The elite charade of changing the world? By Anand, I think it's a journalist, Anand Giridharadas, if I got the name right. That was a powerful tonic for me to read that and challenging, the notion that you're going to be able to change these core power dynamics without significant social movements from below. So this doesn't point to a path towards that, but so I don't know if you have anything to add.
I don't know. I'm looking forward to reading that book. I was recently at an Aspen Institute conference, and Aspen Institute is this organization that kind of brings together all these prestigious businesses and NGOs to kind of talk about the world's problems, and they were talking about sharing wealth. Businesses needing to share wealth. We see this huge inequality. It's going to be detrimental to our businesses. But the conversation was very much, how can we keep things the same and fix the problem? How can we keep things the same for us and fix the problem? The system is perfect, free markets, but how do we fix the problem? So I didn't see a lot of will to actually change. It was kind of like, I don't know what it was for, actually. So I don't have an answer, though. I think it's something that merits a lot of thought, but it's really sticky.
I do think that that a virtue of this approach, that it's relational, that there's, certainly in the United States, there's a belief that, the problem is only the floor and the bottom. Let's get people up beyond the poverty threshold, but you cannot refuse to see that somebody's billions are connected to the fact of billions not having hardly anything. It is on some level a zero-sum game. You can't educate individuals out of poverty one at a time by giving them a good education if jobs don't pay well. And so I think a just wage framework that says there has to be a conversation about the connection between excessiveness and poverty, and that somebody's high wage is related to somebody's low wage, even if it's indirect, that maybe will help that conversation along, the sort of commonality component.
And also, despite those power politics, we have seen progress. Like, we have seen companies raising wages. We have seen municipalities raising the minimum wage. So apparently there's a way. We just have to be very smart politically, very clever.
I see Professor Enderle. How about, and then one from a student perhaps, and then we'll need to wrap up.
But just about power argument, one can also say, I mean, the other side of the power argument is that they have the power to decrease their salaries, not to increase them. So they have that freedom, and that means responsibility. My question is here, to what extent do you, in the framework, also have to account for who is responsible for creating jobs? You assume that the jobs are created, and then you look at this, but the first question is, if companies as well create jobs, but they are maybe not perfect, but it's better than nothing.
That's true. One thing about, companies have become a lot more productive in recent years. And after the downturn, I think companies shed a lot of people and then didn't rehire people as the economy got better. They just put more work on the people who were there. And that kind of goes to what you're saying. They could have brought those jobs back and they chose not to. So, yeah.
I mean, my answer to that is that, people who have faith in the American-centered capitalist system should have faith that, perhaps more regulations on excessive pay at the top, what I'm calling excessive pay, or more higher pay minimums, or more what are seen as regulatory burdens on an employer to help promote the well-being of their employees. I have a lot more faith, it seems, than a lot of free marketers do in American entrepreneurs' ability to figure out other ways to make money. If everyone has to raise their wages and labor costs to become a higher part of their costs, if everybody's in the same boat in that sense, to me, the smart entrepreneurs will be the ones to figure out the innovations and the way to squeeze out costs elsewhere. So that's where I have faith in the American entrepreneur. And so I'm less worried. I'm certainly concerned about the future of jobs, but in a political context where we don't promise to people that they're going to be okay if there aren't jobs there. That's a political problem that worries me. And in terms of the economy, the sort of sky is falling when the minimum wage gets raised and the people say that jobs are going to be lost. It's never happened anytime the minimum wage has been raised. It's never happened historically. And, I don't see it happening again. If you raise the minimum wage, employers find out other ways to make their money. And if a few fast food joints have to close down, I don't think that's a solution to keeping the minimum wage low. Anyway, the student.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for the talk. I thought it was really interesting concept that you guys are trying to launch here.
For those who find it interesting, we have a few of these just wage handouts. I didn't bring a lot, but I have some, and they're union printed, meaning that the labor that went into them is well compensated.
So I guess to kind of give context around the question that I want to ask, I kind of, when I come to talks like this, I have a lot of privilege to be able to attend a university like Notre Dame. So I try to take myself off my pedestal of being in academia. I came from a small town in South Jersey. My family's in the commercial fishing industry. First person in my family to go to college. And the commercial fishing industry, I think, is a good example. It's probably not on its own. It probably mocks a lot of industries of your wage is completely based on performance, right? It's how much you want to work, how much you go out and catch. Unfortunately, seafood prices have been rising, so for the most part, it's providing people with a pretty good wage. And you can earn a good living fishing. It's not an easy job, right? There's a lot of risk. We lose families that, fathers all the time at sea. So there's certainly a lot of risk that comes with that. And one of the biggest challenges that I think has been facing the commercial fishing industry, not just in South Jersey, but across the whole eastern seaboard, is taxes. So the cost of living in New Jersey, you mentioned the high cost of living in certain places like San Francisco, is quite high even in South Jersey. I think combined, my father pays probably over 50% in taxes to the government. That's his income tax, state, federal, and then property taxes. And I think when you're living in a place like New Jersey, and you keep seeing your taxes increase, your state and your local taxes increase, but you don't really see that you're getting much more back from your government than you were maybe 30 years ago, right? School districts haven't improved. You're not getting any more services from your municipalities. So like, where's that money going? And additionally, I think a perfect example of living on the coast, right? We have access to a lot of wealthy individuals who have incomes. So right, the municipalities are taxing those waterfront properties extremely high. So we, in a sense, are redistributing the wealth, right? That's supposed to be going back into our local school districts, paying for our police officers and other municipal workers. But the fact is that even in that situation, the cost of living for these blue-collar workers is really high. At what point do we hold government accountable and actually start, part of the blame is maybe not on the employer, but also on how our government is taxing our citizens?
Absolutely, we have to hold government accountable. I turned down a job in Jersey because of the taxes. Yeah, so I get what you mean. And I think one thing you said was really important is, are you getting for your money what you want? I mean, excessive taxation is if you can't bear it, that's too much anyways. But I lived in Canada for a while and pay a lot in taxes in Canada. I didn't feel it that much. I didn't feel the taxes there as much as I do here because, for one thing, my health insurance costs were way lower. All the schools were good. You could live in any neighborhood and you had a basically good school. If it snowed, the streets were clear by the time you went out, as opposed to here. It's kind of shocking to me. I would be driving to work in the snow. So I saw benefits from my taxes. I didn't think about it as much. I thought about it, but I agree that part of it is that it keeps rising and we're not seeing the benefits, and other parts of our lives are not improving as a result.
I think we'll have to pause, but I hope you'll be available. Folks have one-on-one questions. I invite you to come up. Thank you very much. Let's